Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. I'm delighted to be welcoming Mr. Hatem Al-Mosa, the CEO of Sharjah National Oil Corporation, to join us on this week's session. Welcome, Hatem.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here.
Well, Hatem, perhaps we can just kick off with a little bit of reflection. It is early in July, early in the new half year, if you like. And so a moment to reflect on where the last 6 months has gone very quickly is the answer. Nonetheless, dominated, of course, on all horizons by the war, the Russia's war in Ukraine, which ultimately moved oil prices from a kind of an $80 to $90 frame to $110 to $120 frame. How do you look now, reflecting on the first half of the year, on how big a change to the energy markets has taken place, and how big a factor was the war, or wasn't it?
You know, this reminds me a little bit of the beginning of COVID. If you recall, right before COVID hit very hard, there was an oil price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia that significantly caused a significant drop in oil prices at that time. And then COVID hit, and it wiped out the energy markets essentially at that time. And what we're seeing here right now is almost similar, but from the opposite end. The markets were already recovering, and demand was already recovering a lot by what's perceived as the end of COVID, even though COVID is still very high numbers right now, but its impact is much lower because of the symptoms. And then on top of that came the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think in both cases, COVID was really the biggest player and the biggest factor. Initially, the price destruction was pretty much done by COVID, mostly. The Russian-Saudi Arabian price war only started it. And now the recovery from COVID is really still the dominant factor, the recovery of the markets worldwide. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine just made things much worse. But it was—
So in essence, you had the trend lines already embedded, but I mean, as you said, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, oil prices and natural gas prices were already at multi-year highs, and the Ukraine conflict kind of gave it an extra wind in its sails.
Exactly. Just put salt on the wounds that were already there. I think we were heading in that direction anyway. It just the Russian invasion of Ukraine made things much worse, much faster.
And when you say we were heading there anyway, why do you think that was, that we were heading there anyway?
Because the market recovered faster than the oil markets are able to recover. If you recall, almost 2 years ago, and in an interview with you, I almost kind of predicted this was going to happen at the end. Basically, during COVID, investment in the oil and gas sector pretty much stopped completely.
Right.
And I said, when the market eventually recovers, oil sector will not be ready to absorb all of the demand increase, and there will be a price hike. And at that time, I said shale oil will come to the rescue. Well, my predictions were not entirely accurate because shale oil did not come to the rescue. Shale oil is coming very slowly still. And essentially, most of the producers of oil and gas in the world are at their maximum production. I think the only 2 countries in the world left with some spare capacity is the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And I don't think that—
well, I think perhaps one of the surprises of the first half of the year was the fact that the United States did not return to its pre-COVID production level, still over 1 million barrels below. It was above 13 pre-COVID. It's now about 1 million still below that. Even with $100+ a barrel, it's quite surprising they haven't taken advantage of that.
I really expected that they would come back much faster than they did. Pretty essentially, oil production in the U.S. increased by 1 million barrels over the last 12 months, from 11 to 12 million barrels a day. And if you just use the same trajectory, they would be back to pre-COVID levels within 1 year from now. That's a long period of time to save the markets today. Also, investment in the general oil and gas sector in the rest of the world. As you know, oil projects take 2 to 4 years from the time of initiating a project until you see production at the end of the pipeline. And again, these 2 to 4 years are not finished now. So we expect another year before you see the fruits of all the investment that's happening currently in the oil and gas sector. There's a lot of investment everywhere in the world. It's just, you're not going to see.
But in the US, and I think it's part of that legacy perhaps that you reference in terms of the lack of investment that went into the E&P in the recent years, and even pre-COVID, that the international oil major companies this year were returning a lot of income to their shareholders rather than investing into new capacity. I suppose, why would you, if perhaps each time you add an extra barrel or an extra dollar of investment, it has the threat of lowering oil price?
Yeah, the problem, Sean, we tend to have very short-term memory. This is not the first time we go through this in the oil and gas business. We've gone through this many times since the 1980s.
Anything different on this occasion? I mean, looking just in the first half of this year, we're seeing obviously the OPEC Plus and the national oil companies come back to being much more as a savior, seen as the leading force rather than the following force.
But I would say the whole oil and gas sector is trying to recover, not just the national oil and gas companies, the international oil companies, small oil companies. Everybody's trying their best at the moment to fill the demand that's actually at the moment not filled. And you're going to continue seeing this until you see a destruction of the price when the supply exceeds the demand. And it is going to happen. And I think it's going to happen within a year, probably not more than that. I know you see a lot of gloomy predictions of oil, i.e. supply not meeting demand until the end of 23 or into 24. I think it's going to happen before the end of 23. There's just so much investment in the sector everywhere. For example, number of oil and gas rigs in the US, until today, they have not recovered to pre-COVID levels. I expect it's going to be at pre-COVID levels as early as August this year, and it's going to continue to rise. So it will reach like 800 rigs, operating rigs by August.
You could see going forward that the US oil production exceeds what it was pre-COVID. But before we look to the future a little bit, I just want to touch on the other big story of the first half of the year and get your thoughts on it. And that, of course, was the war in Ukraine. We mentioned the Russia's war in Ukraine, but the consequence of that, which is ultimately a lot of redirection of energy flows, Russian oil coming into the east of Suez market, east of Suez oil going into the Mediterranean basin, US LNG coming into the European market. Your thoughts on the change of flows? Are they permanent? What do they mean?
Nothing is permanent. It looks permanent while you're trying to do it until it flips to the other direction. Geopolitics, unfortunately, has been always a very strong player in affecting the oil and gas markets, whether it is international politics or local turmoil within specific countries, like what's happening in Libya, for example, at the moment. until they get resolved. And when they happen, of course, and they always happen at very unpredictable times, they will cause spikes up or down in the market. But the general trend of the oil and gas markets the general fundamentals of the market do not change over time. It's the main factor that has the strongest influence is the long-term ability of the oil producers to match the demand or exceed it or not meet it. That's the strongest long-term driver for prices. All the geopolitics usually will have limited impact over the period of several months at any point in time, not years. At the moment,
it is hard to see at this time that Europe are going to turn to Russia anytime soon once they manage to actually extract themselves, or if indeed they succeed in that or not, I suppose.
Honestly speaking, I am concerned about the next 9 months for the health of the whole world economy, not just the energy sector. It is not good for the oil and gas producers, these very high levels of prices. What we need is stability in the world. And the world economy needs reasonable energy prices, not 120 or 150 or $380 like I've seen in some predictive report. That is not good for anybody, not good for the oil producers, not good for anybody in the world. We don't want the world economy to be destroyed by high energy prices. And the next 9 months are going to be very tough. It depends all on how Putin plays it. If he decides to retaliate and stop completely the energy flow to Europe, then Europe will not be able to put enough gas in their storage for the next winter. And the impact on the rest of the world could be disastrous. I mean, we are seeing several countries right now almost failing because of the very high energy prices, like Sri Lanka. It has a severe impact on Bangladesh, Pakistan, and many other African countries. And add to it, of course, the crisis of wheat from the Ukraine that has stopped. A lot of countries are surviving now on their strategic reserve. When that runs out, things are going to get much uglier. So really, it's imperative that this war in the Ukraine stop as soon as possible. And if Russia does any drastic action in terms of cutting energy supplies to Europe, the consequence could be very severe to the whole world, not to Europe.
Well, it looks like they already are quite severe, as you say. And when you look forward and you think about some of these impacts, that sort of the second half of the year, we start the second half with oil prices at an average of about 113, 114, which puts the average oil price on Brent for 22 already trajecting towards $110 for the year. Do you see anything there? Obviously, you've highlighted the economic potential for economic slowdown. Maybe that would be a force to bring prices down. Do you see anything tangible that could take us off this 100+ trajectory in the second half of the year?
Honestly speaking, I don't see things getting better for the second half of the year. And as I said, it all depends on Russian actions, but it's not just Russian actions. Europe has made it very clear that they don't want to depend on Russian energy supplies in the future. So if Russia decides to say, okay, you don't want my energy, I'll stop it right now when you still need it. If you're going to hurt me, I'm going to hurt you more. You don't know how Putin thinks. So for the rest of the year, if anything, I expect things will probably get worse unless something big happens.
When you say worse, you mean higher energy prices?
Yes, worse for the world, not for the oil producers. Energy prices going higher, not lower, or at least staying where they are. And it's not just oil. Oil has increased to $120. That's a 100% increase from the $60 that we've seen much earlier. Gas is what worries me more. The gas prices we're seeing today are out of control. I mean, we're seeing $40 per million BTU on the spot market. Anything above 20 is equivalent to the $120 oil. So when you're talking about $40 for gas, you're talking about equivalent of $240 oil. That is totally out of control market. And it's essentially the reason of it is supply is unable to meet demand. Until this moment, for the oil sector, supply is still meeting demand. We haven't reached an out of control market in the oil sector. But that could happen. Could things slightly change from where they are? Because we're pretty much at the edge. As I said, the only two countries in the world that have some spare capacity are the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And if we keep pushing the UAE and Saudi Arabia to open up 100% of their supply and demand still exceeds it, we're going to go enter an out of control oil market. And we may actually see the $300 oil if that happens. I don't think strategically it's a wise decision to keep pushing the UAE and Saudi Arabia to open the last drop of oil that's available to the market. We need this little cushion that we still have left to prevent an out of control market.
Well, we have all of the other countries, obviously, most notably the three big oil producers that are under stress: Iran, Venezuela, and Libya. Now, Iran and Venezuela are under sanctions. Libya are under civil unrest. But three big OPEC oil producers unable, for multiple reasons, to bring supply to market. It seems that that would be a potential source if the politics could find its way forward.
Yeah, that's a very big if.
Yeah.
Let's say it's very unpredictable if. Libya, if something, a breakthrough happens internally, can bring in their shut-in production very quickly. Iran, to a certain degree, can also bring production fairly quickly, not as fast as the Libyan production, if the sanctions are lifted. But I'm not seeing anything clear that the sanctions on Iran are going to be lifted anytime soon. At least soon enough to save the world.
It does look like the JCPOA renewal talks, restart talks, have hit a bit of a wall, and there's a lot of heads still banging that wall without any success. Hatem, another big moment in the second half of the year is going to be OPEC plus, the 22 countries or so that will be renewing or looking at the expiry of their current agreement, which sees all countries return to full quotas next month, August. And then they face a decision, well, what do we do next together? Does this dance continue? What do you think is the outlook for OPEC plus?
My opinion about OPEC plus is it's a very important stabilizing entity of the oil and gas, oil market specifically. And OPEC plus needs to remain strong. And Russia is part of OPEC plus, and it needs to remain within OPEC plus. We've seen what happened when Russia and Saudi Arabia went on a price war. It was destabilizing. The point is, low prices or high prices are not as bad as an unstable market with unpredictable prices, because governments can't plan, they cannot set budgets, they cannot know what's going to be available the next day. And when you have an unstable market, people tend to conserve. And countries who are capable of buying oil, they'll buy more oil than they need because they don't know what's going to happen. And when they do that, they cause a shortage in the rest of the world. You need stable markets, and OPEC plus is a stabilizing entity, and it's very important that OPEC plus remains intact, strong, with Russia as part of it.
But you say that, Hatem, would you say we're in a stable market? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's doing that job at the moment. I mean, most producers within that OPEC plus group have quotas that have been increasing for a number of months now. They've been unable to meet that production. By all secondary reports, OPEC plus is way below 2 million barrels or so below even its own target. So the credibility of that looks a little bit suspect.
Again, don't look only at the very short term. As I said, the next 9 months are going to be very tough, no matter what anybody does, including OPEC plus. It's just there isn't enough oil production capacity in the world to meet the demand to be able to lower the prices back below 100 or back to the 60 to $70, which in my opinion, $60 to $70 is a healthy long-term price for oil. And I honestly think we're going to head in that direction within 2 years, back to that level. And then you're going to have a completely different discussion with everybody, oil becoming again the evil polluter of the world, and everybody going against oil and gas again because now there is more than enough supply. It's next 12 months, next 9 months specifically, until the end of the next winter, they are going to be tough no matter what anybody does. So
well, if you look at that, just that OPEC plus piece, of course, when prices crashed and demand collapsed, they were able to find a consensus in an emergency situation. Everybody got their quota and went forward. Now, going out of this agreement, there is so much dislocation, quotas versus actual production capabilities, that they need to find alignment again. If in terms of what a new agreement could look like, do you think it's without quotas? It's let's just stay together and wait and see? What does it say on the page, do you think, in terms of a new agreement?
I expect the quotas has to be proportionate to the capability of production between the different OPEC members. Now we know that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are able to produce more than their quota. A little bit, not that much more, but who knows? I mean, with more investment, they'll be able to produce even more. And there are many countries who are unable to meet their quotas. There has to be, I mean, the quotas has to be a continuous adjusted quotas for these countries that are proportionate to their capability of production. Keeping in mind that some countries are unable to produce their quotas for political reasons, like Iran, Venezuela, or Libya. So those countries will probably be able to increase production significantly once things get back in order. But yeah, it has to be, the quota is an integral part of OPEC. I mean, there's no quotas, what's the point of having OPEC?
Exactly. Well, that makes the potential for a big argument, because inevitably, as you say, don't think short term, and a lot of countries don't think short term when they're negotiating quotas. Yeah, maybe my production level is down right now, but I still want a plus million barrel a day quota because, you know, tomorrow I will grow. It sounds like it'll make a big challenge. But before we go, I'd like to get your thoughts, because the other big question mark for the second half of the year, obviously supply tightness has a lot of challenges, and we've just articulated it, but demand outlook is also the yin and the yang of it. The big one being China. China's had a very uncertain first half of the year with zero COVID and other challenges. I'm wondering your outlook for China in the second half of the year.
I'm not really an expert in China, but
But Asian demand in general, of course, is a critical part of the Middle East energy supply puzzle. China is its biggest customer. It's had a very wobbly year. And energy demand in Asia with this economic outlook, you've said 9 months. That's a lot of you mentioned Sri Lanka, you mentioned Pakistan, you mentioned Bangladesh. These are all big consumers of Middle East energy. Yeah,
and the thing is, with the Russian war in Ukraine, it's also making significant disruption to the big supply-demand picture, because now China and India are now preferentially buying Russian oil at a big discount. And now I heard Iran is making even bigger discount on their oil to provide India and Russia, or India and China. So that is not common market. You know, when oil is being sold at $120 in one place in the world, and it's being sold at $80 at another place in the world. And preferentially, the countries that are under sanctions are selling to countries who are willing to go against the sanctions. Until that changes, it's difficult to predict how the oil market with respect to Russia will change. Now,
that's why I started my conversation asking that these are potentially permanent changes.
Again, there is nothing permanent.
Well, when you look at that point, into the east of Suez market, going over the next 6 to 9 months at least, one could be fairly certain that the current trend continues, discounted Russian oil looking for home in India and China, and potentially displacing Gulf energy, Gulf oil. Does that present a tension within this OPEC plus unity? Is it significant enough for there to be tension? How do these things coexist? Your product's 30% cheaper than mine, no problem.
Again, we're in supply shortage. So it doesn't really matter what happens. If I am Saudi Arabia and I can sell my oil at 120 and Russia sells its oil at $80, I don't mind. I'll take the $120. It's not a big deal. This becomes a problem when there is more supply than demand, and you are competing for the demand. And one of the players is selling their oil cheaper than me, and they're taking away my market. At that time, you would see friction between the different members that can cause another problem, internal problem within OPEC. I don't see that happening in the next 6 to 9 months. But as I said, I really expect that within 12 months, we're going to be seeing a significant increase in the supply, eventually supply exceeding demand. And all of the issues you mentioned could materialize if they don't agree internally with each other to have a stable market.
Hatem, just to wrap up on the trigger of this year, the first half, all of COVID and as well as the war in Ukraine and going forward, the impact that these energy prices have on the energy transition, and particularly in our region here in the Middle East, does it accelerate the opportunity for hydrogen, more gas development? Your thoughts on the impact of these current energy cycle and uncertainty on the energy transition and the big push to hydrogen and other fuel sources?
I expect as a result of this big energy crunch that we are seeing today, that everything about renewables and clean energy, hydrogen, solar, wind, energy storage, etc., everything is accelerating because they see that the oil market can be unstable. Of course, the renewables has its own inherent problems with stability, but they're technical issues, not geopolitical issues. But at the same time, because of the shortage, we're seeing also very big investments in the oil and gas sector, especially the gas. And even Europe changed its stance on the gas, that it is no longer very evil. And you can invest in gas, which I think is a very wise decision, because no matter how you look at it, we are not ready in the world to do away with fossil fuels yet, now, and we need them. And without them, we will have an unstable world, economic, political, civil unrest, etc. We need stability more than anything else. So, and that transition from fossil fuels to renewables, it's going to take tens of years to achieve. During this period, you cannot say stop altogether investment in the oil or gas sector because they're bad. Whoever is saying that, in my opinion, is an irresponsible person that doesn't care about the prosperity of humans in the world. And sometimes I actually think maybe some of the people who are pushing for this so hard don't really care, because they think that humans are the biggest evil on this earth because they're destroying Earth, and they think that Earth is more important than humans. I'm against that, of course, and I think stability is the most important factor, and there has to be a gradual transition from.
But just on that point, Hatem, that clearly there's also a sense, I mean, in pure economic market forces, that the acceleration towards hydrogen, for example, is there's a big first mover advantage on that. And I'm wondering, does this window of time accelerate that first move, the opportunity, particularly for the Middle East, for the UAE and others, or does it slow it down, do you think?
No, I think everything is going to cause acceleration of the transition. It's when you see the fruits of this transition to make a difference in the supply of energy demand. I think hydrogen falls completely out of the picture for the next 12 months and for the next few years. It's going to be hardly a noticeable player in the energy supply, because it's right at the very early stages of infancy to grow up and become an effective player. So really, to make a difference in the current energy crunch that we have, hydrogen is not a player. Other renewables, yes, they definitely are, but also they're not going to save the day in the next 12 months. Nothing we do with renewables is going to save the day in the next 12 months. What will save the day in the next 12 months is an accelerated investment in the gas production.
Which you are doing, of course. And the UAE has just announced an LNG export facility in Fujairah. Are these some of those opportunities that you point towards from a gas point of view?
Right, longer term. Again, next 12 months,
right.
You don't see a project like that happening. It's going to take a few years for it to materialize if it goes through according to normal schedule. I mean, an LNG project typically takes 3 to 5 years to complete. Nothing is going to save the day in the next 12 months. What will save the day in the next 12 months are the projects that have already been in construction for the last 1 year. And the shale oil drilling that will, I'm pretty sure, will put at least another 1 million barrels in the market within 1 year in the US.
Well, also LNG that's coming out of the US to Europe. That's been a big game changer, a huge transformation of the market. What's your outlook for that in the immediate term?
Absolutely. Again, immediate, not tomorrow, but yeah, you will see more and more production coming out of the US within the next 12 months from projects that have already been sanctioned and under construction for a while. And also in Qatar, probably. Even that may not materialize within 12 months, that may take longer. The point is, there is a lot of activity in the oil and gas sector at the moment, and it has been going on for the last 12 months. And it takes a minimum of 2 years to see the effect from the time of start. So yeah, within 1 year from today, that will be 2 years. And that's going to continue for the next several years. And by the end of that next several years, you're going to have an oversupply again, and you're going to have a much lower price. And there we go again.
Well, there we go again. Before we go there again, I'll put you on the spot for your average Brent crude oil price for the second half of the year. The first few days has been $113 Brent. Where do you see the average of the 6 months ahead?
Pure guess. I'd say in the range of 120.
Average.
Average.
Yeah,
so
that's been pretty much, our surveying has pretty much been centered the majority view around that. And it's hard to identify any factors that are going to push it much lower than where it is right now. So we'll have to wait and see. But Hatem Al-Mosa, CEO of Sharjah National Oil Corporation, thank you so much for being on this week's Halftime Talk.